You are listening to Stribling's New York. I am your host, Rob Taub, 710 a.m. on your digital dial and iHeart Media Company. We continue to promote great authors. As you know, we've had some of the world's most famous thriller writers, mystery writers, even nonfiction have joined us. And today we are joined by Christopher Charles in the studio. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
He's written a book called The Exiled, which has been compared to the writing of Jim Thompson, one of my favorites, who wrote The Killer Inside Me and Pop 1280, one of the wackiest books I've ever read. So are you familiar with Thompson's writing?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, Mulholland reissued all of his books, and Mulholland, the imprint of Little Brown, they've published The Exiled, so I have all of them, and I've read all of them. The Killer Inside Me and Savage Nights multiple times, yeah.
I've read all of the Jim Thompson books, so would he be have had an effect on your writing? Is that somebody that got you into this? When did you start reading Thompson?
To be honest, I probably came to him after I already had a draft of The Exiled, but then I devoured everything that I could. And Savage Nights, I think I read more than once. It's one of the strangest books.
Yes. Well, I'm jumping ahead of the game, so tell us about
Sure.
The Exiled and your background and what got you into this.
To be honest, it was unemployment. It was something I'd always wanted to do, but
It's a good motivator.
it is a good motivator. What happened really is, I was 40 years old. I was teaching for an online school that then decided that I could no longer teach online from New York. And, at 40, it's sort of hard to start over professionally.
Had you been a writer before this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I published a book.
Guess you're 40, being on the radio.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I published another book, and we can get into the pseudonym and the reason for the pseudonym a little later, but under my real name, Chris Narozny, I published a book called Jonah Man, a novel. It's set in vaudeville around the turn of the 20th century. But yeah, so the school that I was teaching for decided that for tax purposes, you could no longer teach from out of state. My wife and I didn't really want to move, and I was having difficulty finding a job. So I read an interview with John Banville, who's also Benjamin Black, and he said something to the effect of, if I'd known that Black could support Banville, I would have started 30 years ago. And it's a genre that I love, so I decided to just go for it. I mean, and it worked out pretty well.
Well, the word of mouth is great, and it's called The Exiled. Mulholland Books, so you're in good company.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I couldn't have asked for better.
So give us a little bit of insight into the plot, what it's about, and so on and so forth.
Sure. Well, it started with, I lived in Colorado for a while, and we explored southern Colorado and New Mexico, my wife and I fell in love with the desert landscape. So I just had this idea, or an image really, of 3 dead bodies in a bunker somewhere in New Mexico, a Cold War-style bunker. And it all sort of evolved from there. So, well, who are these people? Who discovers them? Who investigates it? And the main character, Wes Rainey, who I hope will be a continuing character, kind of grew out of that because I wanted somebody. The bunker and the crime, which is a drug-related crime, is very much out of place there in this incredibly rural, almost forsaken landscape. And I wanted him to be more of a piece with the bunker than with the landscape. So I decided, he was an exile. He had moved there from New York.
Rainey was a New York City cop.
He was a New York City
80s.
cop. Yeah.
So you've kind of collided not two genres, but two diverse locations.
Yeah, and sort of two genres to an extent. I mean, one is, the New York story is sort of more of a Scorsese-esque kind of.
And the narratives are different
gangland
as well?
Yeah, I mean, they catch up towards the end. They catch up with one another towards the end.
That's okay. No, I like the different stylization, and I also think it's unique that you've chosen two different locations. So it's like a Tony Hillerman location in New Mexico, and then your Scorsese location in New York City.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that I like about that is it really comes out of my experience. It's not, sort of something that I searched around for. I've lived in both places, and in some ways I've been torn between the two places because they're so different, but I love them both for very different reasons. And it sort of grew out of that. But yeah, I mean, you asked me about the plot. I mean, to get back to the
Yes.
plot, he, Rainey is an undercover agent in New York when he's in his 20s. He gets into some trouble. He develops a drug habit, and is forced to leave, and he kind of goes and reinvents himself in New Mexico, and that's the idea of the Exiled. I mean, originally it was going to be the Exile, but then I realized the ancillary characters were also exiles, so it became the plural.
Is it nobody's really from places like New Mexico? It's like they migrate there from elsewhere. It's like Alaska.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, obviously some people are, but not very many.
No, that's like the. I digress too much, but if you talk about books, it's like Gay Talese's book, Thy Neighbor's Wife. His whole thing about sexual freedom in California was nobody really was from California at one point, so they had no roots. So it took on a different kind of way of life. And you meet people that seem to say, I'm moving to New Mexico, not like, I was born there, it was great.
Well, I mean, I'm continuing with the digression, but that's really true of the United States in general, I think. I mean, I lived in France for a while, and the big difference, I think, socially is that in France they know the people they grew up with, because the whole, the whole country is the size of Texas, whereas here,
Right.
I mean...
Well, it happens in New York. We're both born and bred native New Yorkers, but it is rare.
Yeah.
Lenny Bruce had one of the best lines, which is, he said, if you're from New York and you're Catholic, you're Jewish. If you live in Cleveland and you're Jewish, you're not Jewish. So there is just a uniqueness to New York, but there is a different kind of mentality in terms of small European places. Because yes, when I mentioned earlier before we started recording, I used to write book reviews for People magazine, and I was like, oh well, how come? And I also work for Time magazine. We used to own Little Brown way back in the day, and one of the publishers was like, nobody really reads it. France is like the size of a big state in the United States, and we take that for granted here of how big our country is. But then that's good fuel and fodder for our thriller writers like you.
I should know this. Is this your first book?
Second
book.
Yeah.
Your second book, right?
First book under Christopher Charles.
Under Charles, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, did you have any idols growing up? Like I grew up reading Hammett, and then I guess maybe in high school and college I switched to Robert B. Parker, and I'm a big fan. Well, another thing that just I tend to get really tangential, but you mentioned something about you had this idea for three bodies. Last week we had, or 2 weeks ago, Andy Martin, who's written a book about Lee Child, about how Lee Child writes. And Lee Child Andy called a lot of writers method writers, like Robert Craze, who really does his research. And Child kind of sits there and goes, cleaning person's in the other room opening a cabinet, and then he'll write, a cabinet opened. And, it's like whatever works. And so you had the idea for the three bodies, and was that the impetus to launch the book?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it sort of progressed the way that the detective himself would progress. I mean, it had, the crime before I knew who committed it or who solved it or even who was going to investigate it. And from there, it just becomes, a series of questions. And then you just keep answering those questions until you get, you're really in the plot and you don't need to even be asking those questions anymore.
Well, I have the problem with doing what I've done in terms of reviewing 2 books a week for almost 10 years for people. As I have so many books, I get a hernia moving them around. I have a double hernia at all times, moving them around my apartment.
I like a real book, but there's a thing called Kindle now.
Yes, but I get these from the publishers, right. And this is on my list when I go to Vegas next week. I'm reading this on the plane, but the reviews are fantastic, and the word of mouth is amazing, and it sounds like you've got a hit on your hands. So, is there anything else you want to tell us? Is there a website you have, or should we follow you on Twitter? What else can we learn about
both,
you?
yeah. I'm on Twitter. I think the handle is just Christopher Charles. I'm sort of new to the whole to Twitter. I haven't really twitted much, but Mulholland let me take over their Twitter account for the day on the day that the book launched, so it was sort of a trial by fire. And then I have a website. It's still sort of a work in progress. It's pretty rudimentary, but it's ChristopherCharlesFiction.com. There are reviews. There's an excerpt. I mean, it's sort of an information dump right now. It's not aesthetically very pleasing, but
you got a great cover for the Exile.
Oh yeah.
It reminds me of like the country. I don't know if you read L.A. Requiem, which has like the shot of L.A. and there's this long winding road on the cover of the Exiled, and it's very intriguing.
Yeah, and then on the back they put the New York skyline, which was a nice surprise because I'd seen the front pretty early on. But then when I got the hardcover and I saw the back, I was, ooh, this is really nice. They did a great job. Yeah.
I'm going to read a review from Booklist. It says, Charles's brisk, efficient cop novel brings to mind Vonnegut's observation that while we are all surely victims of fate, we can also be among fate's cruelest agents. And they say, a fresh spin on a genre staple, the haunted cop. And Kirkus Reviews loved it. So does everybody else. So, and if it's compared to Jim Thompson, then I'm in. So
that was my favorite. Yeah.
Heartily recommend this book to everybody. And I'll make more mention of it after I've finished it. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.